This is The Jason Jones Show, powered by Mudhouse Media. Now, here's Jason Jones.
Aloha, everybody, and welcome to The Jason Jones Show. I am your host, Jason Jones, broadcasting from beautiful New Braunfels, Texas, the Hill Country. I will be heading to Oahu this week. I will be heading back to the west side of Oahu, all of Oahu, but today we are coming from the beautiful Hill Country of Texas. I am about to interview the great John Zmirak on integralism, liberalism and illiberalism, Americanism and radical individualism. You need to listen to this entire show with Dr. Zmirak. This is an important show, and we sort out and we discuss some very important topics. You know, John Zmirak is great. His dogs even make an appearance, a very, very brief appearance. It's a great show, so I'm just going to get to it. This episode is being brought to you by thegreatcampaign.org. That's the Vulnerable People Project. Go to thegreatcampaign.org, and for a donation of $20 or more, you get a copy of my book with the great Dr. Zmirak, The Race to Save Our Century. That's thegreatcampaign.org. And this episode is also being brought to you by mypillow.com. And you know it, for a very limited time, Mike is offering 40% off his new slippers. I have a pair. My wife has a pair. We love them. They are so comfortable. You're going to want to get them for your whole family. You go to mypillow.com. You click on the radio listener square. You use the promo code Jones. You get those deep discounts for all My Pillow products. Giza Dream Sheets, the mattress topper, the towels, all of it. Just use the code Jones. Here we are with the great Dr. Zmirak on the Jason Jones Show. Aloha, John Zmirak. Welcome to the Jason Jones Show.
Thanks, Jason. Always a pleasure to talk to you and have it recorded for the ages.
For the ages, for all eternity. Okay, so this is the show. You know, I think I have lured you into some battles that were reckless, and now you lured me into something. And but I'm glad. I'm sure glad you did. We had an article come out this week. Last week, it's our first in a series on integralism. You first brought this to my attention like almost 10 years ago on the rise of illiberal Catholicism, and I didn't see it. I thought, John sees illiberal Catholics behind every tree, and you did, and there are actually illiberal Catholics behind every tree.
Well, I was seeing the acorns, Jason, and now they have grown into crappy little ragweed trees that are making people cry.
Well, yeah. Well, here's the thing. Okay, I put it out there to some integralists, and maybe we should start by defining what we're going to be talking about.
Let's start by defining it. Okay. All right. So I'll say the way integralists describe themselves, and then, or maybe why don't you give me the self-description that they've offered you in defending it, and then I'll offer my own definition. That sound fair?
It would sound fair, but so in preparing for this show, I asked them for two things: their definition of integralism and a question to ask you. And I could not get a definition out of them.
Okay.
And it was quite frustrating. And we're going to get into that, some of the gaslighting and the dissembling.
Did any of them come up with questions for me?
Yeah, there were two questions. We'll get to those. Well, there were many questions. Good. There are only two worth asking you.
All right, well then let me offer my definition of integralism, which no one has convincingly refuted to me. Okay?
Yes.
2 words: Catholic Sharia.
Okay.
Now, that sounds alarming. Scott Hahn for Catholic Sharia? What are you, crazy, John? Have you gone off your meds? I mean, he's at Steubenville. That's the Midwest. They're harmless. They're boring. If anything, they're just charismatics. But you would never have that. John, you're crazy. You're an extremist because you're talking about extremism, and it makes me nervous.
Well, for people who aren't a part of our little tribe, so Scott Hahn is someone I adore. His books have influenced me greatly. He's someone who's universally loved across the ideology. I hate to use the word ideology, but, Catholics universally adore him. His books are celebrated, but he wrote a book recently that to me was really offensive. And we wrote a pretty hard hitting.
The book is called Right and Just.
Right and Just. Okay, go on. Sorry.
Okay, so when I say Catholic Sharia, I mean this. Let's say you and I were talking about the changes that need to happen in America today, right? We would say, first of all, abortion has to be outlawed. Secondly, it would make sense for the government to heavily restrict pornography. We should stop pretending that transgenderism is anything other than a movement to enshrine mental illness. We should tighten up the divorce laws and get rid of no-fault divorce. We should have a policy to encourage single earner families so that women can stay home with their kids and have more of them. We should stop suppressing the birth rate in all the ways that the government does and replacing the kids that don't get born with low-skill immigrants from other countries that reduce the wages here at home, pull fathers out of families in Mexico and El Salvador, and generally dilute and disrupt our culture to the point where multiculturalism, this toxic ideology, gets presented as a necessity for public civic peace. Okay? I think you and I would agree with all that. The integralists say all those same things. We would say some recognition of God and promotion of religion by the government would be good things. We would say that the basic laws of America should be based on the natural law. That is, the truths of good and evil that God wrote on the human heart for all people around the world. Those are the legitimate ground of public policy as our founding documents say. And I think integralists would agree with most of that. So why do you and I object to these people, Jason? What's the one thing they want to do that we don't want to do?
They want laws to derive from our revealed religion, from the teachings of the Catholic Church through its tradition and Scripture.
That's right. So, in theory, when Pope Francis denounced the death penalty, we in America would have to abolish it. If Pope Francis changed the official Vatican line on immigration, we would have to change our immigration policy to match what the Vatican said. If there were another apparition like Fatima and it got approved by the church and it had detailed public policy suggestions for America, like what the defense budget should be, we would have to seriously consider whether to impose those things on our fellow citizens using the force of law. What the integralists want is a Catholic, officially Catholic government, and here's the really critical part, they want it to be intolerant of other Christian religions. They know that we can't forcibly baptize Jews. The church has forbidden that. They know that we won't persecute Muslims and people like that. But because Protestants are validly baptized into the Catholic Church, according to Catholic theology, because Protestants are baptized, they fall under the jurisdiction of the bishops, whether they like it or not. So, according to the integralists, when you press them, when you read the articles they write on their own websites, when you read what they write on social media,
you listen to their
they believe...
You listen to their conferences on YouTube.
Right. They believe that the bishops should censor the U.S. press and that the government or the bishops, they differ on that, whether there should be a church police or the church should simply control the police, should be able to close down Protestant churches and Protestant schools. In other words, maybe instead of integralists, we ought to call them inquisitionists, because they really do want some aspects of the Inquisition here in America. Now, that sounds crazy, John. You must be crazy. Why are you doing this crazy talk? Why are you saying things like that about Scott Hahn? He doesn't look like an inquisitor. He looks like an Amway salesman. You're a radical. You're an extreme. No, I'm just reporting to you what these people say openly, or sometimes they don't say the quiet part out loud. Sometimes they write books like Scott Hahn's new one, Right and Just, that connect every dot in the logical chain except the very last one, the one about persecuting Protestants. They leave that as an absolutely necessary implication of the ideas they have laid out, but they leave the reader to connect the last dot. And that's the way they can get bishops like Joseph Strickland to endorse their books. Because if they did admit where their ideas infallibly and inexorably lead, everyone would dismiss them as crackpots.
So if people who are listening are Muslim or Protestant, this has to be striking and bizarre that there are prominent Catholic institutions that would publicly swing an axe at the tree of religious liberty. I was talking to I'm going to put you on mute there, John.
Sorry.
No worries.
Yeah, sorry.
We love your Beagles. And your Beagles are like, after you, the number 2 guests on the Eric Metaxas show. They don't show up on my show as much as on Eric's show. I tell them I appreciate that. But a prominent integralist said to me recently, or this week, because we were talking about the article, he said, when I was pressing him, he said, are you asking me, do I think Pastor Hagee should be arrested for preaching heresy? I said, yeah, okay. He said, yes, I do. I do think that. I said, would you say that publicly? He said, no, that wouldn't be prudent to say. So then when John and I say the quiet part out loud, you say we make these leaps of logic or we're not being fair, but is it fair to dissemble the most controversial part of your teaching and try to speak between the lines as a public, quote-unquote, intellectual, as a Catholic intellectual? Is that fair? No, John, was that you or your dog?
That was me telling my dog to stop barking at everyone trying to come in and out of my apartment building. Sorry about that.
No, we don't mind. We don't mind.
I wish at some big estates they could be rambling around killing rabbits, but no. Yeah, I have now, let's go back to the Sharia metaphor. I think it's appropriate because the difference between Sharia law and civil law is Sharia is based on a divine revelation, in their case, the Quran. The difference between conservatism that you and I represent and integralism is we want to base law on natural law. Now, natural law is something you can argue about. It's based on our common reason. Integralism, by saying divine revelation will set public law, take reason out of the equation, because I don't know if the person I'm talking to has been given the divine grace by the Holy Spirit to accept the Catholic faith or not. So if he hasn't been given that grace, I have no grounds to appeal to him. All I can do is threaten him. So immediately we go from persuasion to violence and force. And, of course, when you adopt the politics of violence and force, man's fallen nature comes roaring in. And there are plenty of opportunities for us to simply be exercising the will to power and enjoying the prospect or the fantasy of persecuting and bullying our Protestant neighbors. And as your correspondent, he's already has a fantasy of a prominent Protestant pastor being let off in handcuffs for what crime? For the crime of disagreeing with this guy.
On theology.
For his opinions, he wants, on theology. For his opinions, he wants this man in jail. Now, I want Pastor Hagee far away from the councils of our foreign policy. I think he's had very bad influence on our Middle Eastern policy. But the idea that you should imprison him because of his interpretation of divine revelation,
well,
it's un-American and it's un-Christian.
Well, and this is where violence is at the root of all of this. There was that Steubenville conference where there was that Steubenville conference where they were asked by it was an integralist conference, I think, based around Scott Hahn's.
By the way, sort of the founder of the integralist movement, this Father Waldstein, a Cistercian who was educated at Thomas Aquinas College, he was the guy who made the comment you're about to repeat.
Oh, he was the one that gave the answer?
Yeah.
Okay, so the question was, so what about people who disagree with you theologically, for example, Protestants, would they be, are you saying they would be out of luck? And the answer was yes, they'd be out of luck, and the room cackled. But they would not be out of luck. because they would
laugh like a bunch of. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, like effeminate children. They would.
No, I was thinking they'd laugh like a bunch of Bolsheviks planning to collectivize the farms.
Yeah, they cackled.
The tone,
you can see it. It was gross.
The tone of the integralists resembles to me the tone of Lenin when he sent those telegrams about hanging the kulaks and finding tougher men.
Yeah. Fortunately, these aren't Russian peasants from, 100 years ago. These are, I'll be a gentleman, but here's
overeducated, underaccomplished, resentful American graduates of small Catholic liberal arts colleges who are laboring in the same utter obscurity that most of us are, but they're not happy with it. Yeah. They think they should be Napoleon. They think they should be Richelieu.
You said this to me like 5-6 years ago. You said the problem with these small Catholic colleges is they take the children of plumbers, or like my daughter, she went to one of these schools. They take like my daughter, and they make them believe that they're Habsburg royalty. And I think that's what's going on. This is what integralism is. They actually want to be Habsburg royalty. But they said that they'd be out of luck. No, they wouldn't be out of luck. But they would only have recourse to violence, right? And maybe that's right. That's what I want to read this quote from Aquinas, and then I want to define liberalism and radical individualism, because what the integralists would say about you and I are we're radical individualists, and they would say liberalism's a heresy or we're Americanists. But I want to read this quote from Thomas Aquinas that I had sent you. Human law is law only by virtue of its accordance with right reason, and thus it is manifest that it flows from the eternal law, and insofar as it deviates from right reason, it is called an unjust law. But in such cases, it is no law at all, but rather a species of violence. So what you're saying is that...
Beautiful quote.
So what you're saying is that even though we believe in the revealed truths of our Catholic faith, we acknowledge that it's only through grace that we can assent to the truths of our revealed religion, and right reason alone couldn't get you there. And so it would be violence to use the coercive power of the state to force our faith on other people, right? I mean, this is what
it's impossible. It's impossible. You can't use force to make a Protestant into a Catholic. All you can do is make him into a hypocrite who violates the dictates of his own conscience and lies and pretends to be a Catholic in order to avoid persecution. Is that what we want the government to do? Is that what we as Catholics should be encouraging? Hypocrisy and falsehood and people acting against their own consciences and therefore committing sins. It is a sin for someone who's convinced of Protestantism to pretend he's a Catholic and go through the motions. You know who does that? James Martin does that. Bishop Barron does that. They're not convinced Catholics. They pretend to be. Don't we have enough of that? Do we need the government to produce more James Martins and Bishop Barrons?
Now, with the integralists, where would they disagree with what we said right there? Sincerely. Would they sincerely disagree with us? Would they say I have never had one in private deny that they are opposed to religious liberty.
Okay, let's unpack that. You got all sorts of blowback on our article at the Stream, and let me name it for people. Integralism is the opiate of the Catholics. Look it up at stream.org. You got a bunch of angry blowback in public from people saying, you and Zmirak are drawing all sorts of conclusions that Scott Hahn doesn't draw in his book. And then you said, okay. In private, you asked them, do you disagree with persecuting Protestants using the force of government? And you said not one integralist of like 12, you said, who contacted you, not one of them actually does favor religious freedom for Protestants. They were just mad that we were saying the quiet part out loud. Think about that. Now let's go back to the
And I asked all of them
Sharia.
To publicly respond. I said I would even place it at the Stream. I said write a response publicly. We'll place it at the Stream. And but I want you to say what you've just said to me on this conversation, on these private messages as we were going back and forth. And they all said that would be imprudent. That wouldn't be, da 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 da.
No, it wouldn't be, would it?
The problem you and I have, John, in our careers is we say the quiet part out loud. We haven't learned. Like, we're supposed to whisper the quiet part, and we're not allowed to be right before the anointed are right. And we have to wait till we have to learn the hard. We have to wait till there's a genocide in Iraq before we can say, oh, maybe the war was imprudent. We were imprudent in saying the war was imprudent before the war. And
we had the bad taste. We had the bad taste to be right too early, and that will never be forgiven.
And we have the bad taste of saying the truth about Catholic integralism. Now, I want to get to liberalism real quick, because why are we even addressing this? And I don't know how much time you have, John, but there's two things I really want to do with you is talk about what liberalism is, why people are attracted to integralism, and people I admire and respect and friends of mine confess, even when they reject it, that it's appealing to them. And then maybe what is an alternative path out of the darkness of our age. But let's get to liberalism. So they swing an axe at liberal. And then, and why are we talking about this at all? Because there's really only one reason I think I want to talk about this, and that's not that I worry about the integralists, but that with illiberalism being the spirit of the age, I'm not going to tolerate the illiberal spirit in my community, period. So it needs to be addressed.
In other words, we don't want Catholics sitting around fantasizing. All we need is a Catholic Mark Zuckerberg and a Catholic Apple and a Catholic Google, so that we can be the ones filtering information and censoring people and canceling people and engineering people as if we were Bolsheviks in charge of the Soviet government. The only thing wrong with cancel culture is that right-wing Catholics like us aren't doing it. Imagine sitting in Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia and thinking, there's nothing wrong with having the secret police in concentration camps. It's just the wrong people are running them and the wrong people are interned in them. What we need is to put all our enemies in the camps, and we'll appoint all the commandants. That is what the integralists are doing. They are sucking in the toxic, illiberal, bullying, petty, sectarian, selfish spirit of our disgusting era. But they're just slapping the people yellow and white flag on it and saying, but if only we could be bullying people and falsifying people and strangling people's free speech, then it would be good. Is that really what you think Jesus Christ wants us to do right now?
And yeah, right now is the key. If there wasn't this massive illiberal spirit where there are 3 million ethnic Uyghurs in concentration camps, Coptic Christians this week being slaughtered by ISIS, 1,100 Christian Nigerian school children murdered this year alone. If this wasn't sweeping the planet Earth, I would let these Renaissance Fair reenactors alone at their little colleges. But just the problem is that they correspond so perfectly to the spirit of the age, and it's within the church that it has to be addressed. This Professor Pecknold from the University of Dallas tweeted yesterday, I sent it to you, this quote from T.S. Eliot: liberalism can prepare the way for that which is its own negation, the artificial, mechanized, or brutalized control, which is a desperate remedy for liberalism's chaos. T.S. Eliot, 1939. And to think that this Pecknold would tweet something that T.S. Eliot wrote in 1939, and maybe T.S. Eliot was talking about the crumbling of Weimar and that what led to totalitarian socialism, National Socialism in Germany, I don't know. But it just seems like 1939 is a bad time to start swinging an axe at liberalism. Right? It just seems like the worst year in the history of the human family, other than maybe today, to say, hey, you know what, now I'm going to start swinging an axe at liberalism.
I would just like to say something in response to what Pecknold wrote. Illiberalism also generates its own negation. Look at the countries where the government, at the behest of bishops, sometimes against the objections of the popes, actually, look at the countries where the government was intolerantly Catholic for long periods of time. France, and you got the French Revolution and the genocide in the Vendée and the destruction of the church. Spain, where you got the Spanish Republic and the destruction of churches and the murder of clergy and the desecration of the corpses of nuns. Mexico, which had the Spanish Inquisition for a couple hundred years, by the way. Mexico, where you got the Mexican Revolution that persecuted the church and slaughtered priests and killed Catholic peasants. And it seems like when the church takes on the attributes of a totalitarian state, you're just storing up revenge and hatred for a vicious persecution 100 or 200 years down the road, when innocent priests who haven't been involved in persecution and tolerant bishops get persecuted and slaughtered in the name of avenging the Inquisition. Even without state power. If you look at Quebec and Ireland, where the church was kind of like a state within a state, and the clergy were virtually above the law, those places, the moment the church lost the whip hand, what happened? Everyone left the churches. They stopped practicing. They legalized abortion. They started enacting anti-Catholic laws. You know where we've never seen an anti-Catholic persecution? United States of America, where we had separation of church and state, and the church had to work on its own. It didn't have the government backing it up. It had to be vigorous. It had to be evangelical. It didn't get to use the police.
Well, what would you say to people who said, well, we had the illiberal enthusiasms, we had the Know Nothing Party, we had the Ku Klux Klan, we had the lynching of priests by the Ku Klux Klan.
And they never controlled the government? We can rattle off like the 7 incidents of anti-Catholic violence in the whole history of the country. That's like one day of the Spanish Republic.
Yeah.
It's like
one hour of the French Revolution.
1 hour of the French Revolution, yeah. So, I mean, what a bunch of whiners. Here, our ancestors came here before the Vatican even recognized religious liberty at Vatican II. So our ancestors came here from Catholic countries mostly, where things sucked for ordinary people. They didn't get their own land. They were serfs, or they were working in factories for pittances, or they were under they were under feudal governments. They came to America. The Protestants here welcomed them mostly, let them open their churches, open their schools, with maybe 6 incidents in 200 years, which is ridiculous, not even worth mentioning. And our church thrived. Leo the 13th wrote I think it was 1876, or no, I guess it was 1880. He wrote a letter about how wonderful America was for the church. There's so much to talk about here. Talk about the corruption of the church when it gets in bed with the state. Look at the church in the city of Boston, where the Archbishop, the Cardinal, wielded so much political power. He was able to cover up the child abuse sex scandal. Isn't it great when bishops have power? Currently, our bishops are financially dependent on the federal government for 40% of their revenues. And look at them, how they treat Joe Biden. They won't even excommunicate this man who favors sex change operations, personally performed a same-sex wedding, and favors infanticide. When the church gets caught up in politics, it usually ends up the Flavius Caesar. And even when it gets to enforce its policies, all it's doing is storing up hatred for future generations.
Okay, so let's get to liberalism. I think one of the things the integralists do is, no word has more denotations and connotations and senses than the word liberal. So I think they take advantage of that confusion when they criticize liberalism, and also, anyone who resists integralism in all of its vagueness and gaslighting is quote unquote a radical individualist. So what do they mean by liberal? What do we mean by liberal? And people are going, I thought you were a conservative. Now you're defending liberalism. What are you guys talking about? What do we mean by liberal?
Let's start with the true definition before we go into all the errors, okay? A true definition of liberalism is the political philosophy that, all other things being equal, and within the definition of the common good, it is best to maximize people's freedom to make decisions about their own lives. Again, your freedom to swing your fist ends where it hits someone's face. And again, the common good has a real meaning. The U.S. Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were both created to serve a pre-existing people that had concrete interests and had notions of the common good that went beyond gratifying our base impulses. They went beyond maximizing profit. They went beyond the kind of things that libertarians and Randians might consider the maximum extent of the government. You had the U.S. Congress decreeing prayer and fasting in moments of national emergency. The U.S. government encouraged religion, even where it didn't prohibit other religions. The U.S. founding was a moderate, sane version of liberalism based on natural law, insofar as something can be argued for rationally based on the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, basic truths that are not particular to one church. Basic common ground theism that was kind of what the founders agreed upon. So that Calvinists and Baptists and Methodists and Anglicans and the growing Catholic community and the Jews who were arriving could all basically agree, yes, these are sane, decent ground rules that we will use to constrain the power of the government, which, as we've seen through all human history, tends to grow, tends to accumulate in the hands of a few people, and tends to be abused. That is liberalism in its true, proper, and positive sense that you might call classical liberalism. It's not radical libertarianism. It's not Randianism, objectivism. It is sort of the fruit of what Western man came up with after studying the abuses of power of ancient Rome, of Sparta before it, the abuses of power in feudal Europe, and of absolute governments in countries like France and Spain, where an absolute state proved abusive and corrupt. So the American founders, having followed the contest for power in Great Britain over hundreds of years, they learned from the mistakes of their ancestors and tried to create something that was the smallest government possible that could achieve the common good, the biggest amount of freedom that would not impair the common good, but not too little government, not too little concern for the common good. Now, what the integralists complain about is that this founding vision of America has been perverted and hijacked and corrupted, mostly by our courts, with the support of our elites, such that by the 1940s and 50s, courts were pretending that America was founded as a secular country, not a non-denominational Christian country, but a secular country, so that only secular arguments were legitimate. Suddenly, quoting the Bible against slavery and segregation would have been ruled out of court. We wouldn't have had the abolitionists of the civil rights movement without people looking to the Bible for inspiration in their defense of natural law. Natural law forbids slavery. Natural law forbids invidious racial discrimination. These were not just Bible verses plucked out like as if you tried to enforce the dietary code of Leviticus using the police. This is the natural law buttressed by rhetoric from the Bible. Our courts, our liberal courts, started doing things like kicking prayer out of public school, like undermining marriage, making birth control a constitutional right, first to the married and then to the unmarried, and then making abortion and same-sex marriage, and now transgender acceptance, pretending that these things all flowed from our founding principles. The integralists, in what I can only call an act of political despair, have said, you know what? You're right. Planned Parenthood is right in court. Roe v. Wade is a legitimate decision. Casey v. Planned Parenthood, legitimate decision. Bostock, Obergefell. These are all legitimate decisions because, you're right, this country was founded on a nihilist, decadent, hedonist, individualist, rotten core. And so we are not going to fight these cases in court. We're not going to try to pretend that pro-life laws are even constitutional. Close down the pro-life movement, folks. Close down the religious liberty movement. Close it all down, because America was rotten from the seed. It's rotten to the core. We have to cut down the tree, dig up the stump, and plant seeds of something else. Some Catholic fantasy land, Catholic dictatorship that will impose Catholicism on our Protestant neighbors when we can't even impose it on Pope Francis. This is the most ridiculous fantasy. The bronies who think they can live in the magic world of Equestria, the adult men who cosplay as members of My Little Pony universe, they are doing more to affect America's future than these integralists. I cannot begin to express what wankers these people are.
You know what I've gotten the most complaints about is that we refer to them as LARPers, but they're live action role play. But that's exactly, I mean, and this is what my so can we talk? So there's the senses of liberalism. They use all of the connotations. They never distinguish. They just, to them, it's just one word in every sense of the meaning. Right. They never sort of
so Larry Flint and George Washington and James Madison,
John Adams,
and Archbishop John Carroll, Archbishop Carroll, and the whole American Catholic Church from its founding, which signed on with religious toleration and religious coexistence. So all our Catholic ancestors here in America who built the church, Fulton Sheen, all those people are the same. Fulton Sheen is interchangeable with Larry Flint because they all bought into liberalism. And then they accuse you and me of being imprecise and too sweeping in our use of language.
Yeah, we're radical individuals. That's another thing they throw around. And
you and I have a book with an entire chapter devoted to attacking radical individualism in detail.
Yes, we do. The Race to Save Our Century. TheGreatCampaign.org.
Right.
Any donation for $20 or more, you get it. You can read it while your head's on the MyPillow. So, okay, so yeah, they never define what they mean by integralist. They never define what they mean by liberal.
By liberal.
And so then we both understand the impulse, right? You've shared with me that you, as a young man, sort of had this impulse to integralism.
I never thought through the consequence of religious persecution. I like the idea of an officially Catholic government where the culture fits it. So I'm fond of the Habsburg monarchy in Austria-Hungary, but only once it was tolerant. During the Counter-Reformation, it was intolerant, and I don't want that. But by the 19th century, the Habsburg monarchy was extremely tolerant of Protestants and Jews and Muslims, and it allowed total religious freedom. But the emperor would still go to the Corpus Christi Mass. He would be crowned by the Catholic Archbishop of Vienna. So it was a kind of ceremonial recognition that the religion of the majority of the people was Catholicism, but everybody had equal civil rights, equal religious rights. Yeah, in a country like Poland, that might work very well. It might not, but it's acceptable in principle. The idea of arresting Protestant ministers for speaking their mind in public, I don't think that's acceptable even in Vatican City.
Right, and so would integralists, if they were here, name one of them, the Brandon McGinley. Brandon McGinley. Yeah. What would he say to that? What would Brandon McGinley say? I'm going to try to get him on the show. What would he say when we do?
That'd be great.
Do you think? Do you agree with what one of my friends said to me that I think that Pastor Hagee should be arrested for preaching heresy. And by the way, he picked him because he knew how much I despise the influence he's had on our foreign policy. So that's what this is why my friend used his name, someone he knew that would have like an emotional reaction to me. So
Right,
what would
right.
someone like McGinley say to that?
They would say that every time someone goes to a Protestant church instead of a Catholic church, he is doing an injustice to God himself. And that injustice to God is more destructive of the common good than people just holding up liquor stores. So presumably, Protestant ministers should be punished more severely than armed robbers.
He would say that.
Yeah, based on what I've read of, it is a right and just. I mean, the paragraph we quoted in our article said the common good is injured more by injustices committed against God than it is by injustices committed against individual human beings. So, presumably, Protestant books would be treated like the anarchist cookbook, only worse. They'd be treated as the equivalent of terrorist manifestos by ISIS. Once you decide that it's the government's job to try to save people's souls, whether they want to be saved or not, or whether they agree with your idea of salvation or not, once you think it's the government's job to micromanage the religious lives of everyone in the country, you are on the road to absolute tyranny. You are on the road to totalitarianism. Let's talk about the case of Edgardo Mortara. This is a famous controversy. It happened in the Papal States around 1849, I believe. This Jewish family had a Catholic nursemaid, the Mortara family. And their little boy, Edgardo, looked like he was going to die. Thinking that she was helping him out, concerned that the little baby was going to go to hell, this illiterate nursemaid baptized the child. And it was a valid baptism because it was an emergency situation. It was illegal, illicit, but valid. Then she told the papal government, this child, I baptized him, he's now a Catholic being raised by Jews. So the papal police came and took the child away, saying that as a baptized Catholic, he had the right to a Catholic education, which his Jewish parents were not going to provide him. And the Vatican never gave the child back. Despite international controversy, they never gave the child back. Now, let's think about the implications. Oh, by the way, First Things magazine ran an article a couple of years ago defending what Pope Pius IX did in kidnapping that Jewish child.
So somebody who messaged me on Facebook responding to our article also defended it and said, well, you should know that Jewish boy grew up to be a priest. So what do you think now? So
I mean, the Christian kids kidnapped by the Turks grew up to be enthusiastic Janissaries. I guess that was okay too.
No, I'm of course we agree on this.
Yeah, no, I know I was actually quoting you there. But okay, I like to follow things to their logical conclusions. I'm annoying that way. So if it was right for Pius IX to take away that Jewish child because he was baptized, now a Catholic, so you have to raise him as a Catholic. If his parents won't do it, well, that's child neglect. We're going to take him away, put him in the system. That applies to every Protestant child, too. Every single child baptized, according to our theology, is baptized into the Catholic Church. And he remains a Catholic until his parents or his school or whatever convince him of some other version of Christianity, and then maybe he becomes a material heretic. And then once he really embraces it, he becomes a formal heretic. I mean, this is all Catholic terminology and jargon. But by the argument that says Pius IX was right to take that Jewish kid, in an integralist society, it would be right for Catholic bishops to kidnap all the baptized children of Protestants and raise them as Catholics. Now, has that ever been tried historically? The answer is yes. Louis XIV, when he persecuted the Huguenot Protestants, at one point in the persecution was taking away their children to raise them as Catholics.
Okay, but right now the integralists are yelling. They're like, we're not saying that. We're not saying we're going to kidnap everyone's children.
But they think that. No, because it wouldn't be prudent. In other words, they couldn't get away with it. They're saying what they think they can get away with. This is why I don't just say that integralism amounts to Catholic Sharia, but the way integralists talk about it is the equivalent of Catholic taqiyya. Taqiyya is a tactic that Muslims are permitted. They're permitted to speak dishonestly in some cases if it advances the interests of Islam. So it's fascinating to me that the integralists are aping the tactics of radical Islamists.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, and that's where, okay, so here's one of the, I want to get to how we appeal to a firm banister out of the darkness, so people attracted to integralism have somewhere to place their hands and be thoughtful and leave the darkness of this illiberal cave. But one of the questions that I was asked to ask you is, and I immediately had an answer, but the question was, isn't it an easy thing to do? Aren't what you and John doing easy? You're picking the only acceptable target to the right of you is conservative Catholics to attack or pick on integralists. Aren't you picking on an easy target? That was one of the two questions I thought I would ask.
Okay, well, it's not so easy a target in the sense that I'm having to take on people with much more name recognition and visibility than I have. For instance, Scott Hahn. I'm taking on people like Patrick Deneen, who are considered eminent Catholic academics. I'm just a columnist for a Protestant website. We're within our little Catholic subculture. These are not helpless, frivolous, tiny little targets. These are people with growing influence and power.
No, I get calls from major donors saying, "Stop bullying on bully. Who am I bullying? What? No, why are you picking on Bishop Barron and Scott Hahn and James? Like what? What are you talking about?
People with multi-million-dollar annual budgets. We are criticizing them in our little podcasts and weekly columns, and we're bullying them. Stop bullying the Chinese government, Jason.
Yeah, no.
Stop picking on the poor little Chinese government.
Yeah, right. When I'm not fighting the CCP. And by the way, Scott Hahn's book before this, I bought for so many people on the Eucharist, on the Mass. I like Scott Hahn. Actually, I think of him as a friend. We have a lot of family and friends in common. We're part of this community. The last thing I want to do, but the book made my blood boil, and the reason about this was
the new book
made my blood boil. The answer I gave to the friend who said, "Well, aren't you picking on an easy target?" As I said, "Well, actually, no. Integralism is conforming to the illiberal spirit of the age. Right. You have this Sohrab guy on with Bishop Barron. How bizarre is that? You have one of the most prominent illiberals with someone who preaches indifferentism, and they're allowed to communicate together. I don't understand that how people can celebrate the Benedict option and then Scott Hahn's It's Right and Just in the same breath. That they can say, let's abandon the political life of our community, and then at the same time, I guess let's fantasize about being Catholic monarchs. I don't understand. I don't know what's going on there.
Well, here's how it works, Jason. They don't want to do the work. They don't want to show up in state legislatures to lobby for better laws to protect the unborn. They don't want to have to actually help the Uyghur Muslims against religious persecution. They don't want to have to defend our Second Amendment rights. They don't want to have to do anything. So on the one hand, they can adopt the Benedict option by saying, "Oh, it's futile to do it under these current circumstances." But then they start to feel bad about that. They start to feel like, I don't know, they're being irresponsible and slothful and failing in the virtue of patriotism, maybe. They can say, "Oh, but I am contributing to the restoration of a true future Catholic society that will be achieved someday in part because of my efforts."
Oh, that's what they say.
And their efforts amount to, clicking the like button on one of Sarah Amari's intemperate, irrational columns at the New York Post.
Yeah, by the way, this week, Sohrab tweeted out that he basically is longing for the day that China rules the world. That China deserves to rule the world, not the decadent liberal West.
That's right.
which
right.
I should probably put a screenshot of that tweet in the
You absolutely should put a screenshot
show
of that.
notes. Oh,
People need to see that. These kind of tantrums. These people are throwing tantrums. And I think integralism is basically like Homer Simpson throwing a beer can at the television.
Yeah, and so
Nothing more.
And this is where I get frustrated. Let's get to with something you and I have been trying to do in our writing for over 10 years now, I think, and in our movies and in this podcast, is where I agree with the integralists. Going back to Hannah Arendt, one of my favorite quotes of hers is that we live in a world without banisters. There's really no firm place to put your feet or to put your hands as we're moving through the darkness out of a century of genocides, democides, total wars, all of this chaos and confusion. So what's the banister out of the dark? And to me, as a Christian, first and foremost, it's to live a life in solidarity with the vulnerable. How to get between those suffering violence, not fantasizing about how one day I can be the guy inflicting violence on a marginalized community, but rather,
exactly,
how can I stand with the Uyghurs, standing up, Muslims in East Turkestan, fighting for their life against atheist socialists? How do I stand with the Christians in Nigeria against radical Islamists? How do I stand with Yemeni's children against soulless CIA operatives and their cronies and partners in Saudi Arabia? How do I get between the vulnerable and the violent? Not how do I sit here and fantasize about how one day maybe my great-grandchildren will be the ones putting Muslim Uyghurs in concentration camps. How great will that be?
That's right. Yeah. Yep. You know, one more thing I think it's important to bring up. In a previous book of his, which I actually was the editor of for publication, was a book called Politicizing the Bible.
Scott Hahn's book. I got to buy that book. It's just like $100. So Politicizing the Bible.
In it, he says, there's nothing in the New Testament or in early church tradition to justify the Pope or the bishops persecuting Protestants. Because of this, medieval popes had to rely on the Old Testament. They had to claim that every pope has inherited the same authority over the church that Moses had over Israel. And that included, in Moses' case, persecuting Canaanites and executing witches. So every pope is another Moses. That is the position of the integralists. The only way you can justify the persecution of Christians by the state, by the pope, is to pretend that every pope has the same authority that Moses did. That includes inflicting the death penalty. Wrap your head around that. If we look, there is no evidence of any of the apostles advocating the persecution of heretics. Our Lord said, if people don't listen to your preaching, shake the dust off your feet and go to the next town. When the apostles said, can't we rain fire down on them, O Lord? He rebuked them. Our Lord rebuked the integralists in the New Testament. The church did not even reluctantly take part in the persecution of heretics until the Roman state under Theodosius started pressuring the church, saying, we made you our official religion. Now you're torn apart by heresies. We're going to start arresting these people. It wasn't the church that came up with that idea. It was the Roman government, which still had slavery and gladiatorial combat and legal prostitution, by the way, so it wasn't exactly a perfectly Catholic government. And it wasn't until the year 1000 that any person was burned at the stake for heresy in the West. That happened in Spain, and it was something that local Catholics had picked up from the local Muslims who were burning Muslim heretics. The idea that the church taught religious persecution from the beginning is simply false. It is at best a 3rd or 4th century innovation. It was never taught infallibly. It is not part of the dogmatic teaching of the church. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been able to guess virtually everyone at Vatican II, even Archbishop Lefebvre, signed the Declaration on Religious Liberty. And every pope since Vatican II has interpreted Vatican II in the same way, that it grants and protects religious liberty for Protestants and Orthodox, as well as members of non-Christian religions. The integralists are now saying the Church taught heresy in 1965 at an ecumenical council, and every pope since then has reaffirmed that heresy. If that's the theory, if you really believe that, where was this Vatican authority supposed to come from? The Vatican itself can't be relied on to teach accurately on something as basic as this.
Well, and that gets to your original point, which is when you pointed to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire with the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, the collapse of the Caliphate, that with as the papacy becomes unreliable and it breeds confusion, they're desperately looking for some firm authority to listen to. Where to me that as Christians, apostles, as sailors, we're to set our sails to the wind so we can do what it is our Christian duty. Which primarily, one of my great frustrations with the integralists is that I think it's a great scandal that would make our faith unattractive to people. I want to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. I think they're a scandal. That's actually the number. I wish that were what makes me most upset. What makes me most upset is that while they're playing, is they're LARPing, I would rather Steubenville or the University of Dallas hold conferences on religious freedom, on what's happening in Nigeria or Egypt or Iraq and Syria or in China. Yeah, but I don't think they're speaking on China because of our Pope's secret deal. So Bishop Barron has never said a single word, never said the word Uyghur once, has never spoke up for the Christians in China once. I would like to see some of these courageous schools, let Steubenville hold a conference on the Uyghur, on the plight of the Catholic Church in China. Will they do that? So when I asked a friend at Steubenville about that, he goes, well, Jason, that's not our job. That's your job. It's not who says it's my job? How is it my job any different than any other Catholic's job? Why is it Steubenville or UD's job to have LARPer conferences?
That's right. And let me just clarify. The reason I call them LARPers is, Renaissance fairs, people dress up in different medieval and Renaissance costumes. These people are the Inquisition reenactors. So they're the ones who dress up as heretic burners and witch burners, and they try to go after the neo-pagan D&D kids who are down at the apple bunting booth. I hope I have adequately conveyed my lack of respect for the integralists as a movement and as people. I think the implications of their ideas are so obvious and so evil that these people should be avoided. They should be ostracized. They should not be given platforms at any Catholic institution. And if you find out someone calls himself an integralist, you should ask him if he supports the religious persecution of Protestants. And if he says yes, you should lose his phone number and block his email and forget he ever existed. That's my advice.
Okay, Jen, and I want to end on this, again, because I think we've talked about it a few times, but why are we spending so much time talking about them? Why is it important?
Well,
when clearly they wield zero influence anywhere in society. So why are we talking about them?
I have written maybe 10 articles about this in 10 years, so I don't think that's an obsession. You and I have had maybe 2 podcasts on this out of how many 100 podcasts you've done. Why was it right for people to be warning back in 2015 about the transgender movement? If in 2015 you had told me we were going to have to be fighting people transferring biologically male rapists to women's prisons because they suddenly said they identified as women, I would have thought you were crazy. But if you had brought me solid arguments and said, no, look, this is happening. There are movements promoting this. There are movements that want drag queen story hours for little kids in public libraries. There are movements that want... any crazy movement starts small, and the way it gets big is that people ignore it and they give it platforms and they treat its adherents with respect that they don't deserve, and they refuse to ask tough questions like, well, what are the logical implications of this? No, they don't do that. They don't want to ask those impolite questions. No, that would be saying the quiet part out loud. My job in life, Jason, is to say the quiet part out loud.
Why do you think Bishop Barron, who is very careful, he doesn't associate publicly with pro-life activists, he never takes on tough issues, but yet he feels perfectly at home bringing like Sohrab onto his show or having conversation with Sohrab? Why is that?
He doesn't pay attention. No, the people on his staff did not red flag Sohrab Ahmari as having converted from being a bad Muslim to being a kind of a Sharia Catholic. They just didn't bother. They didn't do their work. They didn't see it on his in his archive at the New York Post, and they don't know that he endorsed this book. And we are doing the work other people are not going to do. We are tracing these logical arguments to the next and logical last step. It's an unavoidable last step. If you believe that Protestants praying in their buildings are committing injustice against God, and if you believe that that injustice is more serious than street crime or domestic violence, then you have to say the state should do something about it and prevent it from happening. If you say A, you must say B. But these people are leaving B kind of like dotted lines, that like a coloring book, so that the reader can draw the last step and feel all proud of himself. It's also it's kind of they're kind of luring them into the movement, like the Church of Scientology. They don't lead with Xenu and our spirits being blown out of volcanoes and space gods. They don't lead with the really crazy stuff. You actually have to get into the movement for quite a while and pay a lot of money to find out about the space gods. And by that point, you've already invested years of your life in this. And the sunk cost fallacy, you don't want to admit that you've wasted those years of your life. So you stay in and you double down and you keep drilling. I mean, the reasons people stay Scientologists are the reasons that they didn't want to pull out of Afghanistan. If we don't send more soldiers to die, we'll be dishonoring the soldiers who already died pointlessly in this futile effort. I think they're hoping to lure integralists in with all this nice conservative-sounding talk, and they sound like they're the most hard-line opponents of our contemporary decadence. But they're, on the other hand, they're telling us you don't actually have to do anything because the situation is hopeless. You know, go watch some Netflix. Go read A Confederacy of Dunces again. It turns out it wasn't just a satirical novel. It was a political manifesto.
Yeah, I've never seen any of these people engaged in any sort of battle that I've been engaged in. They've never been to my left or my right. And what's interesting about Sohrab is he's Iranian, right? And he was Shia. All of my Iranian friends were so scandalized by political Islam that not only are they no longer Muslim, don't even bring up God around them. It's just something they can't even tolerate because of the scandal of political Islam. It's so turned them off to all religion.
People are going to do the same. And guess what? That happened in France after the persecution of the Protestants. It happened in Spain after the Inquisition. It happened in Mexico. They had their own Inquisition. The church there had absolute power. Protestant churches were illegal. So integralism is a cure that is worse than the disease.
No, that's for sure. And there's a type of personality that's attracted to it, right? I think there's a spiritual sickness. They're effeminate men. I've never met a woman integralist. I'm sure they're out there. But they're generally very effeminate, very physically weak LARPers. I'm just being blunt. This is what I see in all of them. Like they've never picked up a hammer. They've never done 5 push-ups in a row. And I'm not being mean. But if I were to say if there's one thing that connects them, it's just weakness, and they're LARPers. They're fantasy role players, and they're completely loveless I mean, we live in a world where if you really want to order your life to serve the vulnerable, the number one cause of death in this country right now under 30, I think, is suicide and opioid overdose, right? There's a homeless epidemic in all of our communities. Organize your life, care for your neighbors without homes, coach Little League, you know what I mean? Raise money for the persecuted church in Iraq.
Join Operation Rescue and get arrested for closing an abortion clinic. Or go volunteer at a pro-life pregnancy center. Or volunteer guarding the U.S. border against drug cartels. Learn to shoot. Be ready to be the next Kyle Rittenhouse if a mob attacks your neighborhood.
If you're a young man, join the military. I haven't met any veterans either in this sad little pathetic community. Actually, I was with a group of young people, I think, that were attracted to Integralist a couple of months ago. My advice to all of them was to do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and or join the military. And they looked at me like I was crazy. So I want to say you hinted at this earlier. One of our lines of gesture when we work together has always been this. We're only going to say what needs to be said, and no one else is saying it. So we're always saying things that really we don't want to. For example, Turkey is shelling Syrian Christians. Okay, no. If we're in the front page of the New York Times and CNN were covering it, we would talk about it. The Uyghurs. If the mainstream media was covering it, we wouldn't talk about it. Integralists, if Scott Hahn were writing against it instead of for it, we wouldn't be talking about it. So if it seems like, why are you talking? It's this sort of been just the rule. And my rule has been, well, the only things worth saying are the things that need to be said that others aren't willing to say. Then that's where I will step in and say something. And I think the reason the reason I want to write and speak about the Integralists is because we have enough loveless, passionless, slothful Catholics in the world. And I would hate to see influential Catholic writers inspire some young person rather than order their life to be just to their neighbor and to show their love for their creator by serving the vulnerable, be swept away into some fantasy, insane, cruel, vicious fantasy world.
Yep, exactly. If you really need to reenact part of the Middle Ages, I understand the impulse. I played the game Medieval Total War II. You refight the Crusades. But, I know that I'm burning up steam. I know that I'm not actually laying the groundwork for anything. It's just a way of killing time. A little bit more intellectual than watching World's Dumbest Thrill Seekers on TV. Go ahead and indulge your impulse for nostalgia by, I don't know, maybe learning about Renaissance architecture. Study Middle English or Old English. Go read the Fathers of the Church. We could spend all day talking about the things that would be more useful than indulging in power fantasies about arresting your Protestant neighbors. I think that's just really Catholic porn.
So what I want to say is I know there are Integralists right now throwing tomatoes at their iPhone or whatever they're listening to the podcast on. Email me. Message me. Some of you got my number. Call me, and I would love to have you on and tell me what we've got wrong. And then I can even ask you more questions about the things I hear in the Integralist community that scare me that we haven't touched on, which is conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism and things like that, which we haven't even addressed, that sort of live in these communities. And it's sort of a dirty little secret. But I think it only helps to bring these things to light because if our mission is to order our life, the show yesterday that we did was really on the persecuted church. We talk a lot about other ethnic and religious minorities on the show. Yesterday, our last show, we focused on the persecuted church. Today, we're talking about our church wanting to persecute minorities. And it's really just unbelievable.
It's so obviously an example of psychological projection that, it's like the kind of thing your therapist would feel guilty charging you for a whole session for diagnosing. And people have said, called me an Americanist. I'm proud to be an Americanist. At least I know I'm free. But let's look at the Americanism thing. One encyclical by Pope Leo XIII addressed a very narrow series of propositions which may or may not have ever actually been taught by anyone. It may have just been a caricature. And he said, yeah, these go too far in the direction of the American system of government. Well, Pope Francis has said a lot of things in encyclicals. He's said we should have open borders. Pope Francis has basically made room for divorce and remarriage in the Catholic Church. He said that the death penalty was always evil throughout all history. Apparently, papal encyclicals are not infallible. So don't hit me over the head with Leo XIII's Americanism encyclical. I don't care. I'm not impressed. Papal encyclicals not blowing me away at the moment because they're a dime a dozen, and half of the ones that come out today are heretical. So clearly, they're not protected by infallibility. So shut up about Americanism.
Yeah,
I'm not impressed.
Yeah, they'll talk about, that's it. They'll say, integralism versus Americanism.
That's right.
But they don't define what they mean by, are you talking about representative government?
Really, what
rule
they
of law,
mean is
separation of powers, habeas corpus. What are you talking about?
We should really just start calling it what it is. It's Inquisitionism. Because the only difference between their program and the program of Pat Buchanan and Fulton Sheen and
me,
Al Smith and you and I, the only difference is they have secret sexy fantasies about Pastor Hagee in handcuffs. Ooh, it's titillating, isn't it?
I might have those fantasies too, but I would never act on them. That's the difference.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
All right, Jason.
All right,
I got to
John
get back
Zmirak.
to the Total War II. I want to accomplish something.
You get back to Total War II and give your Beagles a treat. They didn't interrupt us. This was a long show. I think they interrupted us only once. So tell them thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
All right, bye,
God
John.
bless. Talk to you
Aloha.
soon.
All right, guys. I hope. Sorry, I hit the mute button. I hope that you understand why I did this. This is a long show on integralism, something I don't even want to talk about. And I'm going to have our first article. I don't know if our second article is going to be up yet when the show goes live, but I'm going to have, I'll put our first article up here. And as soon as the other articles come out, you should just be following us at the stream anyways. And I will tell you, nothing gets me more upset than integralism. And the reason why is it's nothing even to do with their LARPing. It's that you're telling me that you have time for conferences and to write books on this nonsense when our church has been MIA on all of these important, basic, fundamental human rights issues. If you want to, if you're thinking about the political life of your community, if you're thinking about sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ, if you're thinking about standing in solidarity with the vulnerable, how do you have time? Why are you having conferences on this? It is loveless to me. The problem with integralism is I think at the root of it, it is devoid of love. And in Scott Hahn's new book with Brandon McGinley, it's always justice this, justice that. At the heart of justice is love. And if I'm looking across the room at my iPad charging over there, and I happen to know that I have computers in my house, clothing in my house that comes from Xinjiang, as the China calls it, East Turkestan, comes from factories where forced labor was used. I am culpable in that. I have a responsibility to advance the dignity of the vulnerable, stand with the child in the womb, to serve the political life of my community from the State House to the White House. I don't have time for role-playing fantasies. And I think the problem I'm having in my mind with the show is a lot of you, especially if you're not Catholic, are like, "What? Why did they even bring this up?" Well, Scott Hahn is prominent. University of Dallas had a conference on integralism this year. So did Franciscan University of Steubenville. And I think it's just an enthusiasm like the Benedict option that will be swept away. It's just, something that people are clinging to in these dark times and will be swept away. But I don't want anyone to be attracted to it because at the heart of it, it's loveless. Now, if you're an integralist and you want to come on here and you're like, you got it all wrong, you've misrepresented what we believe, come on this show. I'm going to ask you some tough questions because then it'll be fair. Because there are things that I hear that come from the integralist community that are very dark and that are very frightening, with the conspiracy theories, with the anti-Semitism, and with these fantasies of religious persecution. So come on the show and we can talk about it. This episode, by the way, is being brought to you by the best pillow in the world. And if you are a faithful listener to the show, I suspect right now you have your pillows, you have your sheets, you have the amazing mattress topper. If you don't, the code is Jones, and you go to mypillow.com and you hit the radio listener square. But MyPillow told me we are selling a lot of pillows and sheets and mattress toppers, and they were so moved by this audience that they said we're giving you a special deep discount for your listeners, 40% off, limited time only, for these amazing MyPillow slippers. And so you go to mypillow.com, you click on the radio listener square, you use the code Jones, and you get these slippers for 40% off. And I think it's only going to last about another week. I need you to get these slippers. They are amazing. And this episode has also been brought to you by the Vulnerable People Project, standing in solidarity with the vulnerable. Go to our website, thegreatcampaign.org. We are in the middle of our fundraising drive for this quarter. We are 1/5 the way to our goal. We need to raise $50,000 for this quarter. We're at $10,000. And any donation, any monthly donor of $20 or more, you get a free copy of my book with John Zmirak, The Race to Save Our Century, which does have an entire chapter on radical individualism as an ideology of evil. Go to thegreatcampaign.org. You get that book. And also Movie to Movement, my latest movie, Divided Hearts of America, is everywhere you download movies. Redbox, Amazon, wherever you download movies, you will find my latest movie, Divided Hearts of America. Until next time, it's the Jason Jones Show.
This has been the Jason Jones Show, powered by Mudhouse Media.